Welcome to Military Miniatures Magazine. In this issue, we are going to scratch build the ubiquitous Zahnstangenwinde rack jack carried on German vehicles in World War II, simply because many of our small-scale models are sold without this essential piece of standard equipment. While there were different rack jacks in use, ranging from 1.5 to 20 tons of lift capacity, their dimensions were similar enough that we can get away with making just one model to fit them all. We begin by cutting an 8mm strip of 0.4mm plastic card from an old flower pot, which will then be cut into 2 by 8mm sections. Since we're building 3 dozen rack jacks in one scratch building session, we need at least 72 of these 2 by 8mm sections of card. This kind of mass production in assembly line fashion offers significant scale effects. Not only is our investment in project planning divided by 36 production units, our output gets faster and more accurate as experience grows. Using a sharp blade and the straight edge of a geometric triangle, we carefully cut the strip of plastic card into 2 by 8mm sections. This kind of precision comes naturally to scale modelers, but it's completely unwarranted and overly time-consuming. So let's use scissors instead and chop this up really quickly. Now, 2 of these 2 by 8mm sections of card are glued together to create the rack housing. Of course, if cost isn't an issue, you might want to use commercially available 1mm plastic card instead and skip this step in the production process entirely. Much of the seemingly routine and boring work is actually very meditative as you get into the flow of it. Now we need a 4mm strip of plastic sheet from which we can cut 4 by 4mm squares for the pinion housing. The strip is marked at 4mm intervals, and the cutting is again done with scissors to speed up the process. This works quite well if you hold the plastic card at a 90-degree angle as you insert it into the scissors. Now the pinion housing is shaped into a trapezoid by trimming the corners of the top edge. Again, we don't measure this, but simply eyeball every cut. If anything were to go wrong with one of these trapezoids, we simply wouldn't use it in construction of the jack. Now these little trapezoids are glued to the center of the rack housing, with their longer bottom edge parallel to the edge of the rack housing. This fiddly work is actually quite fun, and the rack jack is slowly taking shape as we put these parts together. Next, we used a 4mm hole punch to punch out at least 36 discs of 0.4mm plastic sheet for the crank housing. Hole punches are perfect for scratch building spare road wheels for armored vehicles as well. The crank housing is glued over the pinion housing, but leaving 1mm of pinion housing showing at the top. Next, we trim the crank housing flush with the lower edge of the rack housing. This is only an approximation of the actual crank housing, which is more elliptical, but it's good enough for us. Much of the crank housing will be hidden underneath the crank, so why waste time on accuracy here? Using superglue, the crank is glued to the crank housing of our rack jack. The crank is made of a staple, cut in half and with the handle trimmed to 2.5 mm length. Again, there's no rocket science involved here. We simply trim the long arm of the staple to 4 mm and the handle to 2.5 mm or so. Attaching the crank takes the longest because the superglue dries so quickly and has to be replenished several times. Finally, we cut 2.5 mm squares of plastic card for the claws at either end of the rack jack. One claw is glued to one end of the rack housing, then the rack jack is left to dry before the second claw can be added. It's fiddly business to center these claws on the ends of the rack housing, but practice makes perfect eventually. At this point, the rack jack looks rather fragile, but it won't be once we glue it onto a vehicle for stowage. Now the final step is to glue the second claw to the other end of the rack housing and we're done. The rack jack will be held in place on a vehicle by two brackets made of 0.4 mm expanded sprue, which can be glued to either end of the pinion housing. We glue the holders to one side of the rack jack first. Once the glue has set, the holder can be wrapped around the rack housing and glued to the opposite side. So here is one of our Scratchbuild rack jacks stowed on an HO scale Rocco Puma armored car. Thank you for watching. For more information, you are welcome to visit our website at miniatures.de.